You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bring you another episode of Wildlife Control Consultant. So this is our first official Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Some of you may have been waiting for the Living the Wildlife. Well, we're rebranding. We've had a parting of the ways with Pest Geek Podcast. No, everything, we're still friends. We're just going off into different directions here. So I'm rebranding the podcast. So it's now going to just be known as Wildlife Control Consultant, but we're still going to be dealing with all the things about research-based wildlife damage management. So we get into some of the technical weeds of everything related to wildlife control. That's animals with a spine, so vertebrate pest control, for those of you who use different terms. Our industry is still sort of working through some of those terminologies. Nevertheless, we're glad to have you on board. Wanted to announce that I'm now creating an audio-only version of the podcast, so I'm new to this sort of thing, so I've created a podcast through Red Circle, and I've put up Brodifacoum Part 1 there, so that is available for you, and I've also announced it sort of on X, where I have an account, so those of you that maybe follow anything with what used to be called Twitter, I post there, and I believe I posted it on Facebook as well. But nevertheless, we're glad to have you on board. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, and you can also reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Well, if you've been following along on the podcast, you will know that I have been working my way through brodifacoum, where we're kind of doing a deep dive in the area of brodifacoum. So this is part 3. Don't worry if you haven't listened to part 1 and part 2. That's okay. Each episode sort of stands on its own, but they do sort of combine together, so I would encourage you to go back and listen. So we're trying to do some deep dives in the area of rodenticides, because if we don't understand our anticoagulants or the products that we're using to kill rodents, that is going to become a problem, particularly when you're trying to talk to clients about some of the issues related to active ingredients. The more we can understand, the more we can explain to them the risks, rewards of our products, and also it helps give you some insight in some of the political controversies related to anticoagulants. I'm sure some of you have been following what's been going on in California, which has basically banned the private use of second-generation anticoagulants, and you know what? How California goes, many states follow along, and so there's pros and cons to what they've done over there. They haven't completely eliminated access to second gens. There's just a great more restrictions, and also consumers can't get a hold of it. And I think even the applicators can only use second-gen rodenticides under certain circumstances. So it is definitely something pretty earth-shaking when it comes to the industry and pest control out in California. So feel for you out there, but nevertheless, that's what people in California seem to want. But nevertheless, let's continue here. Now, I call brodifacoum the nuclear weapon of registered rodenticides. I have to put a little caveat on that. It's in America. There are more toxic rodenticides outside of the United States, but nevertheless, we're focusing in here on the active ingredients legal within the United States, and brodifacoum is there. So just to kind of lay the foundation of rodenticide baits, here are some of the active ingredients that are available in the United States. You'll notice that brodifacoum falls under the anticoagulant category. So if you're not aware of this, all rodenticides fall under 2 major headings. That is anticoagulant, that is products that interfere with the blood's ability to clot. So the animal basically dies of internal bleeding and sometimes external bleeding. And then you have non-anticoagulants that kill the rodent by other means. So we're here talking today about brodifacoum. I call it the nuclear weapon. Obviously, a little tongue-in-cheek there, but I do want you to be aware that this is an extraordinarily toxic rodenticide. And so the second gens, as a rule, are orders of magnitude more toxic than the first generations, and they were discovered as a way of dealing with warfarin resistance, so they can be called the super warfarins. And so we're going to be doing this deep dive. So by all means, go back and listen to the first Brodifacoum podcast 1, and then Brodifacoum podcast 2, and then we're doing podcast 3 here with Brodifacoum. So this week we're dealing with an article by Robert B. Palmer, Robert B. Palmer, let me get this out straight, Pauline Alakaja, John E. C.D. Baca, and Kurt B. Nolte. And the title of the article is Fatal Brodifacoum Rodenticide Poisoning, Autopsy and Toxicologic Findings, Journal of Forensic Sciences, Volume 44, Issue 4, 1999, pages 851 to 855. So we're dealing with a human tragedy here. Someone who was exposed to Brodifacoum died. Let me repeat that title for you again. Fatal Brodifacoum Rodenticide Poisoning, Autopsy and Toxicological Findings, Journal of Forensic Sciences, Volume 44, Issue 4, 1999, pages 851 to 855. So the unfortunate person was a 15-year-old girl who was 251 pounds. You may recall that anticoagulant poisoning is weight related, and that is, the heavier you are, the more rodenticide you have to consume to be poisoned. So whether you're a rat, whether you're a mouse, doesn't really matter. The larger you are, the more you're going to have to consume, because there is a need, obviously, to have enough poison in your system depending on the size of the organism. Now, this girl, unfortunately, deliberately ate Brodifacoum-treated rodenticide, and so that was the conclusion of the autopsy as well as the scene investigation when she was discovered. And so you've probably already guessed it. She did commit suicide ultimately, and she, in fact, in terms of her case history, she's already dallied with attempted suicide 6 months prior to her ultimate death. And at that particular time, that first time, she ate Tylenol pills, iron pills, and diet pills all at once, but it did not kill her. Now, Tylenol is a really dangerous product if you abuse it, right? So you don't want to be playing around with Tylenol. There's reasons why there are limits to the dosage on Tylenol, but it ultimately did not kill her. However, during this period of time, a few months afterwards, she did have a heavy menses. She was developing bruises. She had bleeding sores on her shins. And again, all this occurred the prior 1 to 2 months prior to her death. So 6 months earlier, she tried to commit suicide. 1 to 2 months before she committed suicide, she was having heavy menses, bruises, bleeding sores on her shins. However, she had no history of anticoagulant ingestion that anyone was aware of. Now, she was ultimately found dead at her house. It appeared that she was upset over a family argument the night before, and the death scene investigation found that she had access to Decon Mouseproof 2, which contained Brodifacoum at the rate of 0.005%, which is the normal rate in products in the United States. So they found that packaging within her access. Autopsy was performed on her, and what they found was she had many bruises that were 1 to 4 inches wide, of different colorations of green, purple, and red. And these bruises occurred around her shoulders, her neck, her lower abdomen, her buttocks, her arms, her legs, her left heel, and both palms. And so these were 1 to 4 inch size bruises of varying colors of green, purple, and red. She also had something called petechial hemorrhages centered on her shins. Now, petechial hemorrhages, if you can see the photograph, basically are like little dots. It's like someone took a little pencil or something and dipped it in an ink and then just tapped it all over the skin, and you can see these are various sizes. Some are smaller than others, but there's like these little blotches around her skin, and that's sort of like bleeding at the capillary level beneath the skin, and that was coming through in her situation. So that also occurred with her. And then, of course, they did some toxicological studies on her, looking for various other chemicals. They're trying to get a confirmation of what killed this girl. And so they had no evidence found of any infectious disease, so that she was sick with anything. There was no evidence that she abused what they call abused drugs, which would be basically the street or the illegal drugs that people could ask, things like cocaine or some of those street things. And there's also no evidence that she was taking therapeutic anticoagulants. Now, you may know of people that have to take blood thinners, for example, because of a heart condition. She was not on any prescribed medication that was going to be thinning her blood. Okay, so that was not the case for this girl. When they tested for brodifacoum, however, they did get many, many hits. And so they basically do two types of tests. One test is evaluating tissue samples, and the other test is evaluating blood samples. Okay, so the tissues are taken from different parts of the body, the blood is taken from different parts of the body. And so we're going to look at the tissues first. So they looked at her liver, and she had 50 nanograms per gram. In her spleen, she had 34 nanograms per gram. In her lungs, she had 31 nanograms per gram. There was no findings of brodifacoum in her brain. In the fixed liver, that's where they take a liver sample and sort of fix it with formalin, I believe, she had 820 nanograms per gram. So you can see a significant jump there. Of course, liver is where it's a filter, and a lot of our rodenticides get caught up in there. Now, in terms of her fluids, that is, they're checking her blood, they took heart blood, and she had 2,240 nanograms per milliliter of brodifacoum. In femoral blood, she had 3,919 nanograms per milliliter. In vitreous, I'm not exactly sure what vitreous is. There was nothing detected. I think that is the non-hemoglobin part of the blood is what I think that is. They checked her bile, that comes out of your liver, and she had 4,276 nanograms of brodifacoum per milliliter. And then in formalin fixed liver, she had 5,440 nanograms per milliliter. Now, let's just be frank here, folks. All of those numbers should be zero. Okay, she shouldn't have any anticoagulant product in her body, right? There should be none there. So why are we talking about this? I'm talking about this because I want you to understand how toxic this product is. If you ingest too much of it, or you get exposed to too much of it, it can kill you, okay? So it's important to recognize that this was a very troubled girl, obviously, who committed suicide, but clearly it doesn't take a whole lot to do it, at least as a parent. But we'll talk a little bit more about her situation here. Now, the researchers, or I should say maybe the coroner and the researchers, the people writing this particular article, looked at other publications to see if anyone else had been poisoned with brodifacoum, because they're trying to see, if there's any similarities with other cases. Now, they're researching other literature through a search engine called Medline, which employs English-only resources. So they would not be aware of things that occurred in non-English speaking countries. And of course, the material has to be published. Recall that this article was published in 1999, so this information does not cover anything that may have occurred or been published since 1999. So in that particular time, they only found 3 published reports of fatal brodifacoum poisoning, and the emphasis is on people who have died from brodifacoum poisoning. Only 2 of the 3 were autopsied, okay? Both of them had their deaths were caused by massive brain bleeding, right? We call brain hemorrhaging. But in contrast, this teenage girl didn't die from a brain hemorrhage. She didn't die from brain bleeding. She died from bleeding in her lungs, okay? And so this, they believe, is the first reported case of someone with brodifacoum poisoning who didn't die from brain bleeding. Okay. The ultimate report said that the girl likely ingested brodifacoum 1 or more times within several weeks of death. You'll recall that she was getting bruising 1 to 2 months prior to her suicide, including a heavy menses. And so the thinking is that she was already beginning to dabble on brodifacoum poison prior to the day that she ultimately took the fatal dose. So she already had a little bit of material in her system. Now, why is that important? Because anticoagulants tend to have sort of a stepping stone or a ladder effect. That is, if you take a little bit each day, the product is actually more toxic than if you took the total amount in one day. So she may have already had a baseline level of poisoning, and it's likely that she did before she took the ultimate last dose that was enough to kill her. Now they don't know how much she ingested at her death, and they don't know how much she ingested prior. But the point is that she ingested enough clearly to have some sort of physiological effect, and she ultimately took enough on the night of her death to ultimately push her over the edge and kill her. Very sad situation. So her blood work was suggesting that her dosing occurred within 24 hours of death. And that's why they're testing the blood and the tissues, because the rodenticide, the active ingredient, is going to be present in the blood first, and over time that is being cleaned out of the blood, and that's where you're finding it in the liver. So when they're comparing the levels of dosages inside of her blood and her fluids, it was so high it suggested a recent dose. And so they're thinking that she had rodenticide in her 1 to 2 months prior, and then she took that final dose, and that's what spiked her the findings in her fluids, and that was ultimately enough to kill her. Now, the authors had some cautions here, and this is something you want to make sure you're careful with, and never get into the business of self-diagnosis, right? That isn't the purpose of this particular podcast. You need to understand that you don't want to self-diagnose, you don't want to diagnose other people, but you do want to be aware and say if something's going on, is someone, maybe dabbling with rodenticide. It's possible, but it could also be some of the symptoms that she had can also be exhibited by other conditions, okay? We're talking, you're saying, really? Look like that petechial hemorrhaging and some of the others, and the bruising that she had, and the answer is yes. And so what are some of those other diseases that someone has? So be careful going around judging people. I think you're taking brodifacoum. No. You don't know that per se, right, without more evidence. So people with leukemia can be bruising easily, right? And people with bacterial sepsis. Now, you're really sick when you're getting into bacterial sepsis, okay? Rickettsiosis, okay? Another quasi-bacterial infection. Plague, yeah, that's the plague that occurred in the medieval ages, right? Still around. We have it in the United States, unfortunately. And another bacterial disease called leptospirosis that can have some of these symptoms as well. So don't get into the habit of trying to play doctor with people, right? You can be suspicious. Always encourage people to go to a professional, and then tell them what your concerns is, because a doctor isn't necessarily going to be thinking brodifacoum poisoning, right? He's going to be thinking of maybe some of these other things. But if you have a reasonable suspicion, well, then you want to maybe pass that information along, but don't just simply assume that it's poisoning. It could be something else, right? So don't rush to judgment on some of this stuff. Don't play doctor if you're not a doctor. It's a lot harder of a position than what you may realize. Well, I know this was kind of a depressing podcast for you, to be sure, but something I think is important for us to understand just how toxic these products are and how we need to be careful and how we need to evaluate the sites that we're using them. And perhaps we should be thinking about, is that bait station strong enough? Is my spidey sense making me think that maybe this isn't the house I should be using this particular rodenticide? Are the kids behaved? Are people following directions? Should I hide things? This makes your job hard, and I'm sorry for that. But we need to be using prudence in these situations. Should you be using a steel bait station, for example? I don't know. Should you be hiding your bait station so that people can't find them? It's hard to get poisoned by something if you can't find the poison to get access to it, right? These are some things you want to be thinking about when you're dealing with it. So I talk about brodifacoum just to let you know it can kill us, and we need to be careful with it, and it can kill other people. So be careful out there. Well, you've been listening to Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. I hope you've at least learned something and been exhorted by something from this particular podcast. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. Tell me how we're doing. We'd love to have some reviews, and hopefully you'll ring the bell so you can be kept up to date on other podcasts I put out. I tend to publish about once a week, and so we'd be glad to have you aboard. You can also reach out to me with questions, comments, suggestions for new shows at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Again, this is Wildlife Control Consultant. Take care, everybody.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.